Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Friday Five. I'm Mariana, your parent coach from the Montessori Masterclass, and I'm streaming to you live about our Friday Five, where we talk about a yay or nay of toys and why developmentally we'd maybe think twice about one and then what we could do instead. Talk about a practical life idea, a book, and of course, our parenting question of the week. So let's get started. Today's first in the Friday Five is a thumbs up, thumbs down on the busy board. Some of you may have seen these. These are sometimes large, sometimes homemade DIY, sometimes a whole lot smaller. But the idea is that there are lots of different things that keep the child busy. So there could be lacing, there could be, I'll make this a little bit bigger so that you can see it. Sometimes there's a latching thing, there's zippers, there's gears, sometimes there's a light switch. There's all kinds of things in a busy board. And that's exactly what the intent is. The intent is busy. And I think this is where we get into a lot of disagreement from the Montessori community versus the conventional toy community is in the conventional toy, the purpose of it is entertainment. It's occupying the child's time. Whereas the purpose of the materials that we offer the child from a Montessori perspective are really there to support the development the child is already doing. So the child does not need those materials, but it sure helps. Similar to using utensils. Yes, you can eat with your hands. And for some foods, that's perfectly fine and there's no obstacle. But for some foods, using a utensil would make things easier for you to eat your meal. Same thing with the materials. They don't need them, but it would certainly help certain pieces of development go easier if the child had the tools to build that development, which is what the Montessori toys are there for. So, the busy board, just based on that premise of entertaining children, that also means that we are the ones that hold all the interest because we are the entertainers, the child is the entertainee, and these busy boards fall right into that. Also, from a developmental perspective, they're just really, really complicated. Does the child want to do lacing? And maybe they wanted to do that, but the orientation is all wrong because the busy board is sort of against a wall, and it's really hard for them to manage to figure out lacing from there. Or maybe it'd be easier if they could hold, imagine a shoe, they could hold one part of that while figuring out the lace on the other side. So there's no option to manage and manipulate all the various things on this busy board. It really is just here's a bunch of stuff on a board, keeps the kid occupied for a few minutes. And then the kid wants to be onto something else. So, where you're going to see more engagement and more connection with the child is if we separated all these things out. So, I've only given one example here, but the same idea would be true about anything on the busy board. If the child might be interested in different locks and latching mechanisms, well, the Montessori version of that is to just do that, but as a single plate, a single activity, a single experience where the child can practice latching and unlatching, and it's a single plate that they can manipulate with their hands. And then the same thing would be true. We have things called dressing frames where the child has a single board that has a zipper on it or a single board that has buttons on it. So that isolation is going to be really key to the child's learning because number one, we're helping them focus instead of get distracted. But then number two, the child is able to repeat. So that is going to be the key to their learning is if they actually repeat this over and over, which is a natural inclination of children, is to just repeat over and over. The busy board is, you ping from one thing to another and it's harder to focus on just that one. So having various latches as single boards, these are also very DIY, and then potentially the dressing frames, which are dressing closing mechanism. So a zipper, button, snap, Velcro, they make dressing frames with various ones, but that allows the child to really engage with and manipulate these one at a time. So instead of a busy board, separate all that stuff out and the child's going to have more focus and it's going to aid them in actually developing a skill and developing themselves as opposed to just entertaining them. And I know that parents' time is valuable, just like it is for the kid. And what we see is we see more concentration for longer periods of time when we do it in this way, when you isolate and allow for repetition. So it actually is more busy for the kid to do that. All right, let's move on. We've got our practical life idea. So, this week's practical life idea is a small pitcher. So, these are often, if you're looking for it, it's going to be creamer. But this is also a pretty easy find if you look at a secondhand store that has home goods. Usually, these little pitchers you can find, but they're usually the size of a creamer. They can be see-through, so they can be glass or they can be ceramic. It's going to be more complicated for the child the younger they are when it is when they can't see the amount of liquid that's in there. So if you've ever been surprised by you thought a mug was empty and you picked it up as if it was empty and then it turned out to be full and you sloshed the water, if you've ever had that experience, it's because you interacted with that based on assumption that wasn't true because of what you expected in terms of the weight. So you're making a lot of calculations with that the child is still learning about all of that. So when we use glass, it's a see-through pitcher. They can actually see that there's water in there, or they can see that there's no water in there. And it's really helpful for them as they're starting to figure out how much weight, what do I need to do to hold something that's a certain amount of weight, versus how light do I need to hold it if it's another weight. They're trying to explore and experiment all of this. So get either, but I would consider using the transparent glass one for the youngest child, and then you can mix and match as the child gets older. When I say youngest child, this is going to be probably the most applicable from 12 and up, 12 months and up. So some things that a 1-year-old could potentially do with a pitcher is they could, if they have a small cup that they're drinking liquid out of, they could potentially pour water. They could pour water from a pitcher into their little cup. So they're getting a small amount of water being poured into their small cup, and then they can drink. It's very satisfying for the child to feel like they've done things themselves instead of always having things done for them. So when people do things for them, when we could have allowed the child to do it for themselves, we're taking away an opportunity for the building of skills and self-confidence. So if they're asking for more water and we're pouring them more water, well, might as well just get a small pitcher and then the child can do that part themselves. So that's going to be helpful. It can also be a great way for the child to do things like watering plants. Sometimes watering cans, they just hold such a large quantity of water, even the small ones. And especially at 12 months, the child may or may not be walking. So a watering can is pretty hard for them to manage if it's holding any significant portion of water. So using a small pitcher in the interim before the child is really sturdy on their feet and can hold a small watering can that's even halfway full of water is pretty heavy. Until they're ready to do that, a small pitcher can be great because they can still help take care of things like the plants without overloading the water with that. But this can also be more broad. This can be involving the child with baking things. This can be involving the child, even if we're measuring 2 cups of milk, you can you can measure 2 cups of milk and then you can give them portions of the milk for them to pour in themselves. Because a large pitcher might be more complicated for the youngest child. So a small pitcher can be used for all kinds of things, and it's a great practical life activity to be able to allow the child to be able to pour their own things themselves. All right, let's move on to our book. We do a book and then we're going to do our parent question at the end. So, children's book. So, this is one of my favorite children's books, and just generally, and then it's one of my favorite ones about pronouns. So, the book is called They, She, He, Me, Free to Be, and it's by Maya and Matthew. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about this book, if you look for it on Amazon, it lists it at 8 to 12 years. Let me just double check. 8 to 12 years, which is super surprising. And that's not the age range that I would recommend using this book. So this book, basically the premise of this book, it's beautifully illustrated, and every page, it's a very simple book. It's not telling a story. in a sort of, written way. It's not sort of saying it doesn't have a storyline, but it's basically got over a 2-page spread. Maybe it's got 10 to 12 characters. So little human characters, just people. And they all look different. But on every page, it says it uses one pronoun. So it goes through each of these people and it says he, but they all look very different. You turn the page, the next one, she, next page, they. So what's so powerful about this book is that the authors really, really seem to understand early developmental milestones around language. So when the child is learning language, they do something called overextension. So what that means is the child will overextend the meaning of a word to lots of things. So for example, a child at say 12 months, they might have the word ba for ball, or they might have the word mama, but then they might use the word mama for a babysitter or for a teacher. They might use the word ball for an apple. They might use the word ball for something else that's kind of round. And we get a sense that the child's definition of the word is much broader than it should be. So the definition of mama might be person who's taking care of me. And the definition of ball might be things that are round. And so as the child goes through this period of overextension, they have these broad definitions of these words. And then they start hearing the word over and over in context. And they start saying, I never hear the word ball when we're talking about this other spherical thing, this apple. I don't ever hear the word ball when you're talking about that thing. And so over time, as the child starts to get more and more words, so 12 to 18 months, they're picking up a couple of words, 18 months, roughly, big language explosion, 7 to 10 words a day. So when they get into that language explosion, that's when you start seeing that the child is building a bunch of other words. They had this broad category and then they say, oh, I get it. So this one's ball and that one's apple and that one's orange. And so they start saying, so yes, they're all spherical, but this one is this and the other one is that. Or, mama is just this one particular person and not just anybody who happens to be taking care of me. So overextension is really important because the way that the child learns language is its repetition in context. The child is going to misunderstand and then they're going to pare down and misunderstand and pare down all the way until they get the basic definition that everybody is working with. And so one of the best ways to allow the child to be able to live into their gender experience, whatever that experience is for them to be able to live into it, right? Because children are born how they're born, and then they need to live into that. The best way to do that is to give them the ability to experience and disconnect from the super rigid gender stereotypes that the child is often told to fall into. So the child does not connect with those at birth. They have nothing to do with them, but over time they start getting tracked into these gender stereotypes. And so by allowing the child to visualize, here is basically the visualization of overextension, is the child we're basically sharing this person, no matter how they look, and this person, no matter how they look, and they're all using this pronoun. And then you turn the page and you don't have to explain pronouns. You don't have to understand grammar in that way. It's just a way to add into the child's vocabulary this idea and the disconnect from stereotypical sort of gender assignments, and allowing the child to sort of see that this is a self-identifying word that can be used in lots of contexts. So I love this book because it doesn't try to explain pronouns, because I think that some of the other pronouns books, I think, are potentially for slightly older children, just because it gets way too complicated and academic, whereas this book is so perfect for the 0 to 3 age. So I find it, I mean, I'm actually not surprised, but there's that this is being said as 8 to 12 years when it really, really is actually a perfect, well done, developmentally centered book for 0 to 3. This will give the child the language, like, for example, if they heard ball and they think ball is anything spherical, and then they never heard apple, ever, the child is always just going to keep saying ball, but they're going to be like, I don't feel like that fits. But I don't have another word to describe this because no one's ever told me a different word for this. But ball is the best thing I have, but this one's not really there. It's harder for us when we don't have the language, and 0 to 3 is when the child is building language. So if we go back and we think of it from a gender perspective, if the child has an understanding that's like ball and apple, and here are all these options, but it's within context that you need to figure it out, then the child actually says, you know what? This actually is how I'm going to, this is the word that I'm going to use for myself. And that is affirming, and I know how to grab for it. I know what to do when I want to express myself after 3, which is usually when you start hearing a ton of language and when the child is able to tell us their gender. They're able to express that after 3. So to give them more vocabulary to actually articulate what's happening for them is super beneficial. So I really am a big fan of this book. It's a beautiful book and well illustrated, which are always the things that I'm looking for, is a really strong children's author, and then also strong illustrations. Just the visuals, whether or not they're illustrations or photographs, are just very attractive and well done, that the child is seeking out these books because they are really very pleasant to look at. So they, she, he, me, free to be. So here's our final one of the Friday 5. This is going to be our parenting question of the week. And the question is, can you suggest some building toys that can be used for a long time? And what age should we introduce these? So this is a great question. One of the things I would say about this question is there's a question here around building toys, which I can definitely talk about. But then there's another question here about what's going to get my kid to concentrate. And then the third question is, what are the ages of these toys? So one of the things that I would say is that about concentration is it's not about the materials, right? So there's not a magical material. There's not a special material that the child can use that is going to facilitate them concentrating for long periods of time. It's actually about the way in which we interact with the child in the environment that allows for or disrupts concentration. So for the child to interact for a long period of time, the way that we allow the child to do that is we allow them to be bored. We don't save them from boredom. We let them sit in boredom and then decide something to do. So that, I think, with screens, people are more inclined to give a child a screen when the child is bored, as opposed to just letting them sit and be bored. When we see the child sit and be bored, that's when they come up with creative things in their space, and then they play for hours, right? This is like, kids can be very satisfied with a cardboard box. And then they play with that for hours. So that sort of long time use is because we've allowed the child to sit with boredom, and then they've figured out what to do with boredom, with the things that they have access to. So it's not about special materials. However, there are certain things that can make toys go faster because it's solving too much for the child, or it's distracting the child as they use it. So solving too much for the child would be, for example, a building toy like wooden blocks, but they have magnets built into them. So when the child starts to build, then we end up with this issue with the child. They don't really have to make sure that the blocks are going to stay up because they're magnetized. And so they build very quickly and nothing falls down. And that is going to satiate the child for less time than if the child actually had to think, oh man, my tower keeps falling over. So, how do I have to build it to make it not fall over? That's just engaging the child in a deeper concentration. So, just standard building, anything like blocks or something that can be built with Legos, that where it isn't magnetized, it's not sort of like helping them out too much. So the other thing that can happen is that it's just the way that the toy is made is built. It's got built-in distraction. So as the child uses it, it's got different textures and sounds and bleeping and the battery and the this and the that, and it's just that something pops up, and then there's a music thing on the side, and then there's this thing over here, and it's got a built-in distraction. So the child is like, I'm engaging, but also I'm getting distracted. That's going to yield less concentration overall. So in terms of how to introduce these, or what age to introduce these, so I would look at the motor development of the child. So what we see is the child is typically sitting around 6 months. So before that, they're lying on their back or lying on their tummy or being held, but they're not sitting upright. And so what happens is that you don't see a lot of hand-to-hand work, right? So when they're lying on their back, maybe they put their hands together a little bit, but mostly not. And if they're on their tummy, it's hard. They're not going to put their hands together a lot. So if the child was going to be building materials, it'd be very hard for a child who's only laying on their back or only laying on their tummy to actually do that. So a sitting child, however, is actually finally upright and their hands can be used together, which is typically what we need for the building activities. So you can I wouldn't introduce this many blocks for a 6-month-old, but from 6 to 12 months, maybe you could have 3 blocks. They might put them in their mouth. They might do nothing with building. I'd say that they probably will build a little bit closer, like more like 9 to 12 months, more than 6 to 9 months. But it doesn't mean you don't have them available. It's just something that they're looking at, and maybe they don't ever engage with it. But then a couple months later, they're like, oh man, what is that? So I would say maybe a couple of wooden blocks, 2 or 3, no more than that, after 6 months, after sitting. And then in toddlerhood, then that could be something where you add more blocks. So it's the exact same set, but maybe you're going to go up to, 5 or 6 if they're an early toddler, and then maybe you go up to a fuller set as they get into toddlerhood. And then other building materials, things like Legos, those just have small pieces, so you wouldn't want to do those under 3. They have other Legos, but I would, because a building material like Legos is applicable as a toy well into elementary school, I would say that something like the Duplos, the larger Legos, those are just going to be really short-lived. So if you're trying to do something under 3, I would definitely go with blocks more, because the blocks will last and you can use blocks for various things. And but the Duplos, they're going to age out of that and want to have something smaller. So that's what I would recommend, and that's what I would say about building toys in specific. But it's a great question. That is the end of our Friday 5. The Friday 5 is all part of the Montessori Masterclass, where you can connect with a whole team of Montessori educators from around the globe, where we have online courses, we have live groups, we have one-on-ones with families, we do a podcast, and of course, this live stream every week. There is an ebook. Babies Build Toddlers is my first book, and it's now in an ebook. So please check out Babies Build Toddlers. And then lastly, I hope, if you haven't already, grabbed your ticket to the Peace Summit, which is a free 2-day Montessori conference for parents, educators, and caregivers. It's from February 25th through 26th. And I hope you grab your free ticket. Everything is at thepeaceprogram.org. And I hope to see you next time for the Friday 5.